Welcome to this session of Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church in this winter-spring season of 2021 as we study the Bible's big stories. And in this week, we come to the telling of the big story of kingdom and prophets. That story that occupies so much space throughout the books of 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, and then in a sense gets retold in different perspective in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This story has so much within it, so much detail. It covers so much time, really running from about 1000 BCE or even 20 years before that until 587 BCE. So over 400 years of history, not only of a kingdom, but eventually of the two kingdoms, a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah, that constitute the biblical Israel that we look to as, in some ways, our predecessors, the place from which we came, a place from which we garner part of our big story. It's so big that we can't really capsulize it or summarize it in just a single session, but I hope that the passages that I've chosen for us to study are exemplary, that they give us a good view into some of the characteristic things that occur in these many, many chapters of the big story of kingdom and prophets. One of the first things to notice is how many obviously different sources there are that must have been used by the final editors who pulled this whole big story together. They tell us about a couple of them. They reference repeatedly the book of the kings of Israel and the book of the history of the kings of Judah, volumes, works for which we have no existing copies. They are lost to the mists or perhaps the sands of history. How much we would love to see those. Now, we know what royal annals look like, these histories of kings from neighboring cultures in the ancient Near East. And we would assume that Israel had similar kinds of records, annals, histories that were maintained for their kings, their dynasties. So we know that there are some sources there. We also clearly get the sense in some of these stories that there's an effort to explain why a place is named something in particular. Thus and such happened, and that's why this place is named that. Peretz Utzah is one that we see in the readings that we do, because Utzah died there. He was split open by God. And so Peretz Utzah, he split open Utzah, becomes the name of the place. And there are a number of these that we see in which sort of they're called folk etiologies, sources for place names, or we had also seen this, for example, with the ancestors, with the source stories for the names of the 12 sons of Jacob with Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. There's also just common knowledge that seems to be at play here. For example, why is it that we remember that this king had a dynasty that moved on into the next generation, even though the king didn't seem to be very good for the nation or the people, for the kingdom, and certainly didn't pay attention to the things that God expects? Well, then how is it that we know that that king's two sons, for example, went on to reign after he did, rather than having the dynasty cut off for its disobedience? Written sources, folk sources that tell of the the way in which names came about, and common knowledge about things within the history that need some explanation, or just frankly telling the story of the people. What stories were told? We certainly don't tell all the stories from our families. We don't tell all of the stories of our countries. We don't tell all of the stories of our church even. We have certain stories that we tell. And we tell them in a certain way, don't we? And that's one of the things that we want to look at in looking at this big, long story of kingdom and prophets in Israel and Judah. What's the angle that the editor, the composer, the compiler puts on the material as it's fashioned together and linked together with comments that give us insight into that compiler's perspective on these things? Just to start, we can say, for example, that one perspective is that whether the fortunes of these kingdoms are up or down, whether the king is successful or fails, whether the king is faithful or not, whatever happens, whether the neighboring kingdoms make peace or make war, this compiler wants to say through all of it that in all of this, it is God's hand that is at work. God rules, no matter who is on the throne. I would point us toward the end of our readings for this week to take a look at this. If we look in 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 3 and 4, and then verse 20. So in verses 3 and 4 we read, "Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh and for all that he had committed, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to pardon." Clearly, this all came upon Judah at the command of the Lord. And then at the end of the chapter, verse 20, "Indeed, Jerusalem and Judah so angered the Lord that the Lord expelled them from his presence." One basic perspective that this compiler of this big story wants us to get: God rules. God is in charge. One of the other things to notice is that this compiler, quite evidently for detailed reasons that we don't need to go into, can be seen to be a compiler in the southern kingdom of Judah. The easiest way to know that is that it tells the story of Judah after the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed by the Assyrians in the 8th century. But the history goes on for almost another century and a half, and it must have been those in the southern kingdom which survived during that century and a half until 587 BCE. It must have been they who were able to continue to tell the story of the southern kingdom of Judah, and it's integrated into the story of the northern kingdom. So apparently some northern traditions and sources have been brought into the account that is put together by people in the south. Now, another aspect of this is that the way in which kingship was transferred in these two kingdoms, if we do read the whole thing, you can see parts of this in what we're reading. The way in which kingship was transferred differs. In the southern kingdom, it's a dynasty. It's the Davidic dynasty. King David is promised in the first of the readings that we do here in 2 Samuel 5 through 8. God promises a dynasty that will last forever, that there will always be a descendant of David on the throne of David. And indeed, throughout the story, it is the Davidic dynasty that rules in Judah. Some are good, some are bad, some are longer, some are shorter, but it all stays within the family dynasty of King David. Up north, not so much. How many kings did you read about who were killed in the course of this story of the northern kingdom of Israel? I lost count. There are a lot of them. Because in the northern kingdom of Israel, it would seem that there was no established dynasty. There was a succession of dynasties. There were some that lasted perhaps 3 generations. That was pretty good if you could get 3 generations out of your dynasty. But soon another leader arose, often out of the army or from some competing branch of the family, and a king was exiled, or a king was more often killed, and a new dynasty arose. Where have we heard that story before? We don't see that sort of thing going on in contemporary politics, do we? Now, even when the killing isn't literal in our contemporary politics, it's certainly the case that charismatic leaders arise and set aside the leaders who previously had been in charge of things. Well, let's take a look at a few of these stories and see some of the pieces that we're going to be looking at. I've selected some of these because they're the parts of this big story that get picked up by other biblical writers in retellings to go with our theme for this season of Heart, Soul, Mind. There are long stretches of this history that nobody else ever quotes in the Bible. There are any number of kings and prophets and figures in this big story who simply do not register with other biblical writers. But there are a few who are fairly recognizable in a variety of later tales. We look, for example, at Elijah in 1 Kings 19 and his famous trek out into the wilderness, where he's convinced that, well, he's been told by Jezebel that she's going to kill the queen, Jezebel, she's going to kill him. And so he goes out, initially we might think to save his life, but it turns out when he gets out there, he's just in despair. He's ready to give it all up. But he's met by God in the wilderness. Where else do we hear that? And when he tells God, I'm out here because I'm the only one left. They're trying to kill me. Woe is me. I can't do it anymore. God says, wait, go out on the mountain. Go out on the mountain. And there's earthquake, and there's wind, and there's fire, and there's a sound of nothingness. God isn't in them. There's the voice of God asking again, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah, even after all that, repeats, woe is me. They've killed all the prophets. They're out to get me. There's nothing left for me to do. And God says, Elijah, pick yourself up. Go back to society. I'm not finished with you yet. You have kings to anoint. You have your own successor to anoint as prophet. I'm not finished with you. You're not finished yet. But before we even get to this dramatic scene of Elijah's flight into the wilderness and effort to resign from his position, we've already seen him in this pitched battle with the prophets of Baal who are serving the king Ahab and the queen Jezebel, and the almost comic scene on the top of Mount Carmel with which God is the real God, Baal, or the God of heaven and earth, whom Israel worships. And the image of the consuming fire that comes down from heaven and eats up the sacrifice that's on the altar. You may remember that already in Hebrews, in reading the retelling of the Exodus story, there was the recognition or the statement by the author of Hebrews that our God is a consuming fire. Well, there's reason to see that at the top of Mount Sinai, in the telling of the Exodus, there's also reason perhaps to see that here in the consuming fire that comes down on the sacrifice on Mount Carmel. And King Ahab himself, what a fascinating figure. Not exactly all good or all bad, a mixed figure. It says explicitly he was worse than any other king that the northern kingdom Israel experienced, and yet his fate to have his dynasty cut off doesn't fall on him, but on his sons. He hears the word of the prophet about his faithlessness, about his disobedience, and he undertakes a measure of repentance and sorrow for this, which God recognizes and withholds the termination of the dynasty in his generation so that it's delivered on the next one. Is this the example that we have, perhaps, of trying to explain how a king who's known as the worst ever could actually have his sons end up also on the throne after him? That may well be the background of this particular part of the Ahab story. Well, let's move to the southern kingdom for a different figure, and this is Josiah, near the end of that kingdom. Josiah in 2 Kings 23 in particular, with this dramatic scene of the workforce at the temple undertaking repairs, and the head of the workforce has found a scroll in the temple as though it was lost there for centuries. And they bring it to the king, and the king has it read, and he goes into mourning over the fact that he realizes that the kingdom, the people, have not been following this covenant. And perhaps that is why all of this catastrophe has fallen on the kingdom generation after generation after generation. And now Babylon is at the gates of Jerusalem, threatening to destroy it finally. And it's this finding of the book of the covenant in chapter 23 that might be the way that with repentance and renewal of proper worship, including Passover, including tearing down altars all over the land, that maybe renewal of this proper covenantal worship will be what will save Judah. If you look at some of the phrases here in 2 Kings 23 that describe how this book of the covenant is understood, it's not only called the book of the covenant, which resonates with both Exodus and Deuteronomy, but more significantly, it talks about the commands, the laws, and the decrees. That's a set formula of 3 words, commands, laws, and decrees, that recurs over and over and over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy. And Josiah determines to follow this with all of his heart and soul. And we know that from Deuteronomy, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Again, a familiar phrase. And Josiah undertakes a renewal of this covenant, which the writers of this text suggest even the Passover had not been observed any time during the life of the kingdom, from David all the way down to Josiah, not since the time of the judges, but now it will be reinstituted. This is a story that suggests to us that this whole history, from Joshua, Judges, telling that pre-kingdom period, and then Samuel and Kings, has been written by people for whom Deuteronomy is the constitution of God's people in biblical Israel. And it's living within that covenant, under that constitution, that this community that shaped this history wants Israel to achieve, to live as God's people in this way described in the book of Deuteronomy. And so throughout this telling of the big story of the kingdom and prophets, you see how the compiler assesses every king as to being either faithful like David or unfaithful like Manasseh. All the way along, there's an assessment of their faithfulness or unfaithfulness according to these model kings, whether positive models or negative models. And consistently, what is done well or poorly by these kings fits with the way that Deuteronomy either says you shall be God's people or you shall not be God's people. And it's always the prophet. The prophets that we've seen here with Elijah and Elisha, the other prophets that get named, Huldah, the prophet who certifies the scroll that they find in the temple in Josiah's time, all these prophets, men and women, who are the voice of God to the kings. And so we see that it's not just kingdom, it's always kingdom and prophets. The one who rules in God's name and the one who is the voice of God in the king's ear, calling kings to account. And one of the more interesting points, the last one that I'll talk about here, is the way this entire story ends. It's with King Jehoiakim. Oh, there's another king after him, Zedekiah, but he's not actually in the dynasty. Jehoiakim is the last one in the direct descent. Zedekiah is Jehoiakim's uncle, and so there's a kind of sidestepping there. But Jehoiakim, the last of the Davidic dynasty, is the one we hear about in those last verses of 2 Kings, where it says that after a certain number of years, Jehoiakim was released from prison and lived on retainer from the king of Babylon for the rest of his life. What kind of image is that? Here is God's anointed, the descendant of the great King David, the last in the line of the amazing messianic dynasty, living in another king's court and supported by that king. When you've told a story that tries to convince the reader that God is in command of everything, that it's God's way of living that is the standard for everything, how ignominious, how embarrassing, what a colossal fail to have Jehoiakim living seemingly peaceably, comfortably, contentedly in another king's court. One of the issues that folks have had with this history from Joshua to 2 Kings is all of the violence, all of the death and destruction, all of the ways in which God seems at times to be vindictive, all of the ways in which biblical Israel fails to live up certainly to what we would identify as our moral standards. Apart from the fact that that's the way of life, and at least this story has the virtue of saying that there is no other power in life than God, so it may be difficult to understand God involved in, and in some cases seeming to be behind, all of these morally questionable things. In many ways that's better, easier. It's still not easy, but maybe easier than asking, well, what other power is there in the world that's in control if it's not God? That's what this compiler, this story, wants us to wrestle with, is that God is in control of it all. But I think there's another dimension of this too when we look at how the story ends. Because early on in the story, the people of Israel are uncertain about God's leadership, and they challenge whether they want God to be their direct ruler or whether they want a king. And frankly, both opinions are represented in this big story in sections that we haven't read, but they're there. Yes, God wants a king. No, God doesn't see any need for a king. God will be the king of Israel. And out of that conundrum, out of that debate, Israel gets kings. And look what happens to them. They don't listen to prophets. They challenge prophets. They chase after prophets and banish them. But ultimately, it's one of those kings who ends up serving another king in another land where there are other gods. Tell me, how did that idea about kingship work out? It seems to me one way to understand all of the morally problematic issues of these books from Joshua to 2 Kings is to say, well, it's a big, long story that ends up as a bit of a morality tale, saying, when God offers to be your king, don't think that you're going to know better. This is going to be fun to talk about. There's so much here. I know there will be a host of questions. I hope you're enjoying the read, and I look forward to our discussions. God bless.